The quiet voice cut through the dining room, just as Lucien Devereaux, the most feared Mafia boss in the city, reached for his fork. Before anyone understood what was happening, Mara Bell, the plus-size chef who had prepared the meal, stepped forward, lifted his dinner plate from the table, and calmly replaced it with another. The room froze. No one was allowed to touch the boss's food once it had been served. Hands flew to holsters. Several bodyguards drew their guns before the original plate even reached Mara's arms. Lucien slowly looked up. "Explain." Without taking her eyes off him, Mara lowered her head. "My mistake. I used the wrong herb. This plate is the one you were supposed to receive." For one long second, no one moved. Then Lucien gave a single order. "Serve the first plate to the taster." The color drained from Mara's face. She took one desperate step forward. "No." But she was already too late. Nobody in the dining room spoke. The order had already been given. One of the guards picked up the original plate from Mara's trembling hands and carried it toward the food taster. She instinctively stepped forward. "Please, don't." The guard didn't even look at her. In the Moretti estate, orders from Lucien Devereaux were never questioned. The food taster forced a nervous smile, trying to ease the suffocating tension. It was just the wrong herb, wasn't it? No one answered. He cut a small piece of veal, dipped it lightly into the sauce, and slipped it into his mouth. The room counted the seconds in silence. 5, 10, 15. Mara couldn't breathe. 20. The man frowned. For a brief moment, everyone seemed relieved. Then his fork slipped from his fingers. The metallic clang echoed across the dining hall. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping desperately as blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Several guards rushed toward him. One called for the estate physician. Another searched the room for a hidden attacker. Lucien never moved. His eyes remained fixed on Mara. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't looked surprised. She looked heartbroken, almost as though she had been hoping she was wrong. The physician arrived within moments, knelt beside the unconscious taster, and checked his pulse. "He's alive," he announced, "but barely." The room exhaled together. Lucien slowly turned toward Mara. "Bring her." 2 guards escorted her across the dining room. Not roughly, not gently. She stood before the man every criminal organization in the city feared. His voice was calm. "You have one chance. Tell me how you knew." Mara lowered her eyes. "I didn't." Several guards exchanged irritated glances. Lucien's expression remained unreadable. "You stopped my dinner. You tried to stop him. And now you're telling me you didn't know?" She swallowed. "I wasn't certain." "What were you certain about?" She hesitated. "The recipe." That answer only deepened the silence. Lucien glanced at the ruined plate, still lying across the marble floor. "The recipe?" Mara nodded slowly. "The rosemary wasn't the one I selected this morning." One of the executive chefs immediately interrupted. "That's impossible. We've used the same supplier for years." Mara looked at him for the first time. "No. It was cultivated somewhere warmer. It carries more natural salicylates." Several chefs frowned. The physician suddenly looked up from the injured taster. His face changed. "What medication does he take every morning?" The taster's assistant answered almost immediately. "Blood thinners." The physician froze. Then he slowly looked toward Mara. Combined with enough natural salicylates, it could trigger catastrophic internal bleeding. The room fell silent again. One of the guards muttered under his breath. She wasn't guessing. Lucian studied her for several long seconds. You recognized that? By smelling dinner? Mara gave a small nod. I tasted the sauce while cooking. I noticed something wasn't right after it came back from the serving station. Another chef scoffed. You're lying. She calmly shook her head. I couldn't prove it. So I lied instead. Lucian raised one eyebrow. The wrong herb. It was the only excuse that would get me close enough to change your plate. For the first time that evening, no one laughed at the plus-size chef everyone usually ignored. Instead, every person in the room looked at her as though seeing her for the very first time. Lucian broke the silence. What is your name? She blinked. No one that important had ever asked before. Mara Bell. How long have you worked here? 3 years. Lucian glanced toward the head chef. 3 years. The older man nodded awkwardly. Mostly pastries, sauces, preparation work. You never told me about her. The chef lowered his head. She keeps to herself. Mara almost smiled. That wasn't entirely true. She kept to herself because everyone else preferred it that way. In the kitchen, they rarely called her Mara. They called her Kitchen Cow, sometimes loudly, sometimes just quietly enough for her to hear. Too slow, too heavy, too plain. No one mocked her cooking, only her appearance, because criticizing her food was much harder. Lucian noticed the bruises on her forearm where one of the guards had grabbed her. He looked toward the man responsible. No one touches her again. The guard immediately released his grip and stepped back. The entire dining room exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't gratitude they saw on Mara's face. It was confusion, as though she couldn't understand why someone like Lucian Devereaux had just protected someone as insignificant as her. Lucian spoke once more. Tomorrow morning, you'll cook breakfast. The head chef looked stunned. But sir, Lucian cut him off without raising his voice. She'll cook. His eyes never left Mara. And after breakfast, you're going to explain how someone can recognize a different herb without ever seeing it. For the first time since entering the estate 3 years earlier, Mara realized this wasn't the end of the worst day of her life. It was the beginning of something she never expected, something that would eventually matter far more than saving one dinner. It would change who controlled the safest room in the entire estate, not with a gun, but with a recipe. The following morning, the kitchen was louder than usual. No one talked about recipes. They talked about Mara, the woman who had interrupted the boss's dinner, the woman who should have been thrown out of the estate before sunrise. Instead, she had been ordered to cook breakfast. Dozens of eyes followed her as she tied on her apron. Some were curious. Most were annoyed. A few openly laughed. I guess nearly getting yourself shot is one way to earn a promotion. Another cook smirked. Careful, she might swap your plate next. The room erupted with quiet laughter. Mara didn't answer. She had learned long ago that silence wasted less energy than arguing. She moved to her workstation and began measuring flour, butter, herbs, and cream with calm, practiced precision. Every ingredient was weighed by hand, not because the recipe demanded it, because she trusted her senses more than numbers. At the far end of the kitchen, Executive Chef Roland watched her with folded arms. He had never liked Mara, not because she lacked skill, quite the opposite. She noticed mistakes other people couldn't. She quietly corrected sauces before they reached the dining room. She rescued overcooked meat without asking for credit. She fixed broken desserts after everyone else had gone home. And somehow, She made everyone around her look less talented, so they gave her a nickname instead. Kitchen Cow. It started as a joke, then it became routine. No one even remembered who had said it first, except Mara. She remembered everything. Not insults, flavors. Years earlier, while helping her grandmother bake in a tiny countryside bakery, she had noticed something strange. One afternoon, she tasted a loaf of bread and calmly announced that the butter had come from a different farm. Her grandmother laughed, until the supplier admitted their usual dairy had been closed that morning. Another time, she refused to serve soup because the bay leaves smelled too young. Everyone thought she was imagining things. The delivery invoice later revealed the herbs had been harvested almost 3 weeks earlier than usual. Little by little, her family stopped asking how she knew. They simply trusted her nose. But outside that little bakery, no one believed abilities that couldn't be measured. People believed thermometers, digital scales, timers, not instinct. Certainly not the instincts of a plus-size assistant chef who rarely looked anyone in the eye. Mara had stopped trying to explain years ago. She simply cooked. Breakfast service began. Fresh bread filled the kitchen with warmth. Coffee simmered quietly. Eggs hissed on polished steel pans. Lucian entered without warning. Every cook immediately straightened. Every conversation died. He ignored everyone except Mara. "You made breakfast?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the table, then at the plates. "You tasted everything?" She nodded. "Twice." Lucian picked up a cup of coffee. Before taking a sip, he paused. "What kind of sugar?" Several chefs exchanged puzzled looks. Why would he ask that? Mara answered without hesitation. "Raw cane sugar." Lucian lifted one eyebrow. "It isn't." She blinked, then stepped closer. He handed her the cup. She didn't drink. She only smelled it once. A faint smile crossed her face. They switched it. Someone laughed from the back of the kitchen. "By smelling coffee?" Mara ignored the comment. "It isn't raw cane sugar. It's beet sugar. The sweetness arrives later. The finish is sharper. The aroma disappears faster." One of the pantry workers suddenly went pale. I couldn't find the usual container this morning, so I borrowed another one." Silence. Lucian slowly placed the cup back onto the table. "You were right." No triumph appeared on Mara's face. She simply looked relieved, as though the world had returned to its proper place. Lucian studied her for another moment, then asked, "Can you really remember every ingredient you've ever tasted?" She thought for a second. "No." "So where's the limit?" Mara smiled awkwardly. "I forget birthdays." Several cooks frowned. She continued, "I forget names. I forget where I leave my keys." A tiny pause. "But cinnamon from Sri Lanka and cinnamon from Vietnam. I'd never confuse them." For the first time that morning, Lucien laughed. Not loudly, just enough for everyone in the kitchen to freeze. No one could remember the last time the boss had laughed over breakfast. Mara looked horrified. "I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to be funny." "I know," Lucian replied. "That's why it was." The tension inside the kitchen eased for the first time. Even a few cooks smiled despite themselves. Executive Chef Roland did not. His expression darkened, because for the first time since Mara had joined the estate, people weren't looking at her weight. They were listening to her. And Roland had the uncomfortable feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere inside the estate, someone else was listening too. Someone who now understood exactly why last night's plan had failed. And unlike everyone else in the kitchen, That person wasn't laughing. The morning after breakfast, Lucien didn't return to his office. He walked straight into the kitchen. Every chef immediately stopped working. They expected another inspection, another warning, another order. Instead, Lucien looked directly at Mara. "You're coming with me." She blinked. "To cook lunch?" "No." He turned and walked away. To solve a problem. The entire kitchen watched them leave in stunned silence. Executive Chef Roland muttered under his breath. What problem could possibly require a cook? No one answered. Because no one knew, Lucien led Mara through parts of the estate she had never been allowed to enter. Private corridors, hidden staircases, storage rooms guarded more heavily than the wine cellar. Finally, they stopped outside a small conference room. A long table stood in the center. On it rested 6 identical porcelain cups, 6 saucers, 6 silver spoons, nothing else. Lucien pulled out a chair. "Sit." Mara obeyed. He pointed at the cups. "What do you notice?" She leaned forward, without touching anything, without tasting anything. She closed her eyes for only a second, then quietly said, "Someone changed the coffee." Lucien didn't react. What changed? The beans? She shook her head. The water. A bodyguard standing nearby frowned. Water? Mara nodded. 5 cups were brewed with filtered water. She pointed toward the last one. That one wasn't. The guard couldn't hide his disbelief. Lucien looked toward another man standing in the corner. "Tell him." The estate butler cleared his throat. "I accidentally used bottled mineral water for the last pot." Silence. The skeptical guard stared at Mara. She looked just as surprised as he was. "I wasn't trying to impress anyone." Lucien calmly moved another object onto the table. A basket filled with fresh bread. "Now?" She smiled faintly. "The butter. What about it?" One loaf was brushed with French butter. The others were Italian. Lucien looked toward the kitchen steward. Again. She was right. The steward sighed. "We ran out halfway through baking." Several guards exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't luck anymore. The tests continued. Lucien seemed almost amused. He pointed toward a folded linen napkin. Mara frowned. "It was washed yesterday." "Yes, but someone touched it afterward." One guard laughed. "That's impossible." Mara looked embarrassed. "It smells faintly of tobacco. Whoever folded it smokes cigars." Every eye slowly turned toward the elderly house manager. He awkwardly raised one hand. "I folded them this morning." Another silence. Lucien leaned back in his chair. "So, you don't just remember flavors. You notice everything connected to them." Mara shrugged. "I've never really thought about it." By lunchtime, word had spread through the estate. The boss wasn't questioning witnesses. He wasn't interrogating suspects. He was walking around the mansion with the kitchen assistant. One guard whispered, "What exactly are they doing?" Another replied, "I think she's investigating lunch." The strangest moment came that afternoon. Lucien stopped beside a tray of untouched pastries. "What do you smell?" Mara hesitated. "This is ridiculous." "Probably," Lucien replied, "but answer anyway." She leaned closer, then frowned. Someone opened the vanilla after baking. The pastry chef burst into laughter. "That's absurd. We've used the same bottle all week." Mara didn't argue. She simply stepped aside. The pastry chef uncapped the bottle. His smile slowly disappeared. The seal beneath the lid had already been broken. He stared at it in confusion. I don't remember opening this one." Lucien didn't say a word, but another small piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Someone inside the estate had been quietly replacing ingredients, not to improve recipes, to prove something, or to hide something. Not everyone enjoyed watching Mara become indispensable, especially Chef Roland. Each time she identified another tiny inconsistency, his jaw tightened. Finally, he spoke. "This has gone far enough." Lucien looked at him. "You've turned a cook into an investigator." "She's guessing. Nothing more." Mara opened her mouth to respond. Lucien answered first. "Then prove she's guessing." Roland smiled. "I will." That evening, he gathered the kitchen staff. "If her nose is so extraordinary," he deliberately raised his voice, "let's see what happens when she's tested by someone who actually knows cuisine." Several chefs nodded eagerly. Roland had spent decades earning culinary awards. Mara had spent 3 years peeling vegetables. In their minds, there wasn't even a contest, hidden from everyone else. Roland quietly rewrote the menu for the upcoming banquet. Different herbs, different butter, different stock, different finishing oil. Enough tiny changes to confuse anyone. He smiled to himself. If she fails once, this little miracle ends. From the second-floor balcony, someone watched Roland leave the kitchen. Lucien. He had heard every word. But instead of stopping him, he simply turned away, as though he had expected this moment all along. Late that night, Mara found a handwritten note waiting on her workstation. No signature, just one sentence. "Tomorrow night, trust your nose." She slowly looked around the empty kitchen. Who had left it? And more importantly, why did it feel less like encouragement and more like a warning? The annual charity banquet began exactly at 7. Nearly 100 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Devereaux estate. Politicians, business leaders, judges, people who smiled politely while pretending they didn't know who truly controlled the city. Behind the kitchen doors, the atmosphere was very different. No one spoke above a whisper. Every plate leaving the kitchen represented Lucien's reputation. And tonight, everyone was watching Mara. Not because she was in charge, because they were waiting for her to fail. Executive Chef Roland adjusted his immaculate white jacket and addressed the staff. "Our guest of honor believes she can recognize every ingredient." He glanced toward Mara with a faint smile. "So tonight, let's see if miracles have limits." Several cooks exchanged amused looks. They knew something Mara didn't. Roland had personally rewritten 3 signature recipes. Not enough for ordinary diners to notice. Just enough to trap someone who trusted her instincts. One course after another left the kitchen. The first passed without incident. Then came the centerpiece of the evening. Lucien's mother's famous herb-crusted lamb, a recipe almost no one still remembered. Roland stepped aside with exaggerated politeness. "Would you like to inspect it first?" A few chefs chuckled quietly. Mara walked toward the serving table. She didn't touch the food. She simply closed her eyes. The kitchen waited. After a few seconds, she opened them again. Her expression was strangely calm. She looked toward Roland, then quietly said, "Whoever cooked this has never met the woman who created this recipe." For a heartbeat, the kitchen remained silent. Then laughter erupted. One sous chef almost dropped his tray. Another covered his mouth, trying not to laugh too loudly. Roland smiled confidently. "Is that so?" "It is." "What exactly is wrong with it?" Mara looked at the lamb. "The rosemary is correct. The garlic is correct. The wine reduction is excellent." She paused. "But the finishing butter doesn't belong here." Roland folded his arms. "And why not?" "Because it makes the sauce richer." Mara shook her head. "It does. But this recipe was never supposed to be rich. It was supposed to remind someone of home." The laughter faded. No one understood what she meant. Roland certainly didn't. Lucien, who had entered the kitchen unnoticed moments earlier, spoke for the first time. "Bring me my mother's notebook." Every conversation stopped. An elderly housekeeper hurried away and returned carrying a worn leather journal. Lucien opened it carefully. The pages had yellowed with age. Grease stains covered the corners. Tiny handwritten notes filled every margin. He turned to the recipe. Read silently, then looked up. Without another word, he handed the notebook to Roland. The executive chef scanned the page. His face slowly lost its color. The final instruction read, "Never finish this dish with butter. The sauce should stay light enough for the herbs to remain the memory." Roland lowered the notebook. No one laughed anymore. Mara hadn't memorized a famous recipe. She had understood the intention behind it. The guests never learned what had happened in the kitchen. Dinner continued perfectly. The banquet ended with applause. Everyone praised the food. Only the kitchen staff knew how close one man's pride had come to destroying the evening. When the last guest finally left, Lucien looked at Mara. "Come with me." He didn't take her to his office. He didn't take her to the dining room. Instead, he unlocked an old wooden door at the far end of the estate. Dust floated through the air as the lights came on. It was a kitchen, small, warm, almost forgotten. Copper pans still hung neatly on the walls. An old wooden table stood beneath the window. Everything looked untouched. As a child, Lucien said quietly, "This was my favorite room." Mara looked around in silence. "My mother cooked here every morning." She refused to let the staff help. He smiled faintly. She said love couldn't be delegated. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucien walked to a cabinet and carefully removed the same leather notebook. He placed it into Mara's hands. "Everyone thought my mother left me money." A quiet smile appeared on his face. They were wrong. She left recipes. Mara gently opened the notebook. The pages carried tiny notes written in different colors of ink. Cooking times, ingredient substitutions, little jokes scribbled in the margins. Near the very end, she found one final page. Only a single sentence had been written there. "The person who protects someone's meal will one day protect their heart too." Mara stared at the words, then laughed softly. "Your mother was wonderfully dramatic." Lucien looked at the faded handwriting. "No," he smiled. "She was usually right." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward, not heavy, just peaceful. Lucien opened another cabinet. From inside, he carefully removed an old blue apron. The fabric had faded after years of use. Several careful stitches repaired one pocket. He held it out toward Mara. She looked at it in confusion. "This belonged to my mother. I've never let anyone wear it." She accepted it with both hands, almost afraid to touch it. "It should stay with your family." "It is." She looked up. Lucien's voice was calm. "This kitchen has always belonged to the person who cooks with love instead of fear. I think my mother finally found her successor." Mara stood speechless. Her fingers tightened around the old apron. After several seconds, she managed a shy smile. "So, does this mean I got promoted?" Lucien laughed. "No." She blinked. "No?" He took one step closer. "It means I'm never letting you cook for anyone else." Mara felt warmth rush into her cheeks. She looked down at the apron before smiling again. "That's either the sweetest confession or the strangest employment contract I've ever heard." This time, they both laughed. The sound echoed through the little kitchen. Not the mansion, not the empire. Just a simple kitchen where, years earlier, a mother had believed food could protect the people she loved. The following morning, the estate woke before sunrise. The guards changed shifts. The staff prepared for another busy day. Lucien arrived in the kitchen precisely at 7, not for a security briefing, not for a business meeting, not to inspect the staff. He quietly stood beside the counter, waiting. Mara looked over her shoulder. Without even turning around completely, she said, "If you're planning to steal bacon again, at least wait until it's finished." Lucien slowly withdrew the hand he'd been reaching toward the pan. "I wasn't stealing. You were absolutely stealing. I was quality testing. You've already had breakfast. I was considering a second opinion." Mara couldn't help laughing. She handed him a clean plate. "Sit down. I'll decide when it's perfect." For perhaps the first time in many years, the most feared mafia boss in the city waited patiently for someone else to tell him when he was allowed to eat. And somehow, neither of them wanted breakfast to end.